The heavy oak door didn't just close. It slammed with the finality of a coffin lid, the sound echoing sharply across the frozen wraparound porch of the Vance estate. Elena stood there for a moment, staring at the wood grain, her breath hitching in the frigid morning air. On the other side of that door was warmth. On the other side was the smell of brewing coffee and the inheritance that legally belonged to her late husband, but was now being hoarded by a family that saw her as nothing more than a liability. "Come on, Mama," a small voice whispered. Elena looked down. Leo, 7 years old and already forcing himself to be brave, tugged at her sleeve. He wasn't crying. He stood there in his patched puffer jacket, clutching his backpack straps with white-knuckled intensity. He understood more than any second grader ever should. "Right," Elena said, her voice steady. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing her beg. She adjusted the heavy duffel bag on her shoulder. Inside, she had packed their lives. A single heirloom quilt, a box of matches, a hunting knife, and a seasoned cast-iron skillet. Heavy but essential. They walked down the long gravel driveway, the wind biting through their thrift store denim. Behind them, the grand Victorian house stood like a fortress of judgment. Ahead lay the gray, unforgiving expanse of Ashford Hollow. The weatherman on the radio had been warning about a historic freeze for days, a polar vortex dipping down from Canada. The sky was already the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low. "Where are we going?" Leo asked, his teeth beginning to chatter as they reached the main road. "To the old Crenshaw place." Elena lied smoothly, making it sound like a plan rather than a desperate gamble. "It's an adventure, like pioneers." By noon, the paved road had turned to a rutted cart path. They reached the Crenshaw homestead, a ruin abandoned since the 90s. The barn was a skeleton of rotting timber, its spine broken by years of neglect. Snow had drifted high against the northern face. Elena circled the ruin, her boots crunching through the icy crust until she found it, a slight depression in the earth near the foundation. She dropped her bag and fell to her knees, digging frantically with her bare hands. "Help me, Leo," she commanded softly. Together, they cleared the snow, revealing a weathered wooden hatch set flush into the frozen ground. A root cellar. Elena gripped the rusted iron ring. It resisted, frozen shut, but she pulled with the strength of a mother who had no other options. With a groan of metal and wood, the hatch gave way. A draft of stale, clay-scented air rose up to meet them. It was dark, damp, and uninviting. "It looks like a hole," Leo whispered, stepping back. "No," Elena said, guiding him to the ladder. She struck a match against the rough stone frame. The flare hissed to life, a tiny orange star against the encroaching gray. "It's not a hole, Leo. It's a fortress." She lowered herself into the dark, the flame trembling in her hand. The match burned down to Elena's fingertips, stinging her skin before she shook it out. For a terrifying second, darkness swallowed them whole, heavy with the scent of wet clay and ancient roots. "Mama?" Leo's voice trembled in the blackness. "I'm here," Elena said, her voice calm, projecting a confidence she didn't quite feel. "Don't move." She fumbled in the dark until her hands found the rusted lantern she'd spotted earlier hanging from a root. She trimmed the crusty wick with her thumbnail, poured a splash of kerosene from a small travel canister she'd packed, and struck a second match. When the flame caught, it didn't just light the room, it revealed their reality. They were standing in a root cellar about 12 feet wide, the walls reinforced with rough-cut timber and stone. It was a tomb, cold enough to see their breath, but it was their tomb. "All right," Elena said, clapping her gloved hands together. "We're not sleeping on the dirt. Leo, we're going on a scavenger hunt." They climbed back up to the surface. The wind was picking up, howling through the skeleton of the collapsed barn like a wounded animal. Elena moved with the methodical focus of a contractor. She found a section of interior partition that had fallen but remained dry. Old, gray barnwood, probably white oak, tough as iron. "Grab the small pieces," she told Leo. "Anything that looks like kindling." For the next 4 hours, they were a 2-person construction crew. Elena used the claw end of a rusty hammer she found in the straw to pry the planks loose. They carried the lumber down the ladder, plank by plank. The floor was the first battle. Elena knew that the earth would suck the heat right out of their bodies through conduction. She laid the planks over the dirt, creating a subfloor. "Stuff straw in the cracks," she instructed. Leo, his small face determined, grabbed handfuls of dry nesting material from the barn loft and jammed it between the boards. "It's like insulation in the attic," Leo chirped, his fear replaced by the busy work of a mission. "Exactly, we're building a thermal break." By late afternoon, the cellar had a wooden floor. It wasn't pretty, it was warped and uneven, but it kept their boots off the freezing soil. But the air was still biting. Elena turned her attention to the fireplace, a crude circle of stones in the corner. She knew that an open fire would send 80% of its heat straight up the fissure in the ceiling. They couldn't afford to waste a single BTU. She dragged a piece of corrugated tin roofing down from the barn. It was dented and oxidized, but it would serve. She bent the metal into a curved shield and positioned it behind the fire pit. "Watch this," she said as she lit the kindling Leo had gathered. The fire caught, snapping and popping. As the flames grew, the heat hit the tin sheet and bounced back into the room. Instead of drifting upward, the warmth was projected outward, radiating against their faces like sunlight. "Whoa," Leo whispered, extending his cold red hands toward the glow. "It's like a heater." "Physics, baby," Elena smiled, wiping soot from her forehead. She looked around the small space. The amber light of the fire danced against the timber walls, pushing the shadows back. The temperature had already risen 10 degrees. For dinner, she set the heavy cast-iron skillet directly on the coals. She mixed water with the cornmeal she'd brought, stirring it into a thick, bubbling mush. It wasn't a steak dinner at the estate, but when she handed the spoon to Leo, he ate with a voracious hunger. "It's warm," he said, scraping the bottom of the pan. "That's the most important flavor," Elena replied. They made a bed in the corner using the rest of the straw and the heirloom quilt. When they finally lay down, the ground beneath them was no longer an enemy. The fire crackled steadily, the tin reflector humming with heat. Elena watched Leo's breathing slow into the deep rhythm of sleep. He was safe. They had transformed a hole in the ground into a bunker. But as she listened to the wind shrieking across the opening above, she knew the real test hadn't even started yet. They had built a shelter, but could they hold it? By the second week, life underground had found a tenacious rhythm. The cellar was no longer just a shelter, it was a machine of survival. Elena checked her snare lines along the tree line every morning at dawn. The first catch, a scrawny cottontail rabbit, had felt like a miracle. Now it was just Tuesday. She skinned it with the practiced efficiency of someone who couldn't afford to be squeamish, stretching the pelt on a willow frame to dry near the hearth. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke, roasted meat, and the earthy, humid scent of clay. It wasn't the sterile, potpourri-scented air of the Vance estate, but it smelled like life. Leo had adapted with surprising resilience. He spent his days carving small figurines out of firewood kindling, his schoolwork consisting of Elena teaching him how to calculate the volume of their woodpile or identify the tracks of local wildlife. But the isolation was a double-edged sword. It kept them safe, but it also made them invisible. Or so Elena thought. On a Tuesday afternoon, the crunch of heavy boots on snow shattered their peace. Elena froze, her hand instinctively going to Leo's shoulder. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice firm. "Don't come up unless I call you." She climbed the ladder, pushing the hatch open. The light from above was blindingly white compared to the amber glow of the cellar. 3 men stood near the ruin of the barn. They were dressed in expensive hunting gear, blaze orange vests and camo jackets that cost more than Elena's car used to. In the center stood Caleb Miller, a neighbor from down the valley. He was a big man, arrogant and loud, the kind who held court at the local diner and confused his opinion with gospel truth. "Well, I'll be damned," Caleb scoffed, hooking his thumbs into his belt. "I told the boys I saw smoke coming out of the ground. Thought maybe we had a moonshine still out here. Turns out it's just the Vance widow." The other men chuckled, the sound dry and cruel in the frigid air. Elena climbed fully out of the hatch, standing tall despite her worn coat. She didn't shrink away. She looked unflappable. "Hello, Caleb," she said. "You living in a hole, Elena?" Caleb kicked a clod of frozen dirt toward the hatch. "Like a badger? I heard the Vances kicked you out, but I didn't think you'd drag the boy down into the dirt with you. It's unnatural." "We are managing," Elena said coolly. "Managing?" Caleb laughed, a harsh bark. "Elena, the weatherman says the temperature is going to drop to 20 below zero by Friday. That's a killing freeze. You stay in this hole and you're going to wake up 2 popsicles. You're too proud for your own good. Go back to town, beg if you have to." Elena looked at him. She looked at his red, wind-chapped face, his shivering hands despite his expensive gloves. Then she thought of the thermostat she'd rigged downstairs. It was reading a steady 65 degrees. "We are warm, Caleb," Elena said, her voice cutting through the wind. "And we are fed. We don't need your pity, and we certainly don't need your permission." Caleb's smile vanished. He stepped closer, looming over her, his expression turning scornful. "Suit yourself," he spat. "But when the deep cold hits, don't come knocking on my door expecting a handout. I don't harbor fools." "I won't," Elena promised. The men turned and trudged back toward their truck, their laughter drifting back over the snow like smoke. Elena watched them go until they were just specks against the gray horizon. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from a cocktail of rage and adrenaline. She took a deep breath, inhaling the biting air, and descended back into the earth. As she reached the bottom of the ladder, Leo looked up from his carving, his eyes wide and observant. "Was that Mr. Miller?" he asked quietly. "Is he mad at us?" Elena barred the hatch from the inside, sliding the heavy wooden bolt into place. She walked over to the fire and added a log, watching the sparks rush up the chimney she had built with her own bleeding hands. "No, Leo," she said, stroking his hair. "He's not mad. He's just afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that we don't need them anymore." Outside, the wind began to scream, a high-pitched keen that signaled the arrival of the front Caleb had warned about. The deep cold was coming. Elena sat by the fire, sharpening her knife. Let it come. The storm didn't arrive like a guest. It broke in like a thief. It hit on Friday night, just as the weatherman had predicted. The temperature outside plummeted so fast you could practically hear the mercury crashing against the bottom of the glass. By midnight, the wind chill was 40 below zero. Above ground, the world had turned into a white, screaming void. The wind sounded like a freight train derailing directly over their heads, shaking the very roots that wove through the cellar ceiling. Down below, the air was still. Elena sat by the hearth, her posture vigilant. She fed the fire with the driest oak logs she had saved for this exact moment. The engineering held. The clay-sealed walls didn't weep. The tin reflector radiated a fierce, dry heat that kept the ambient temperature at a steady 68 degrees. Leo slept on the pallet, burrowed under the quilt and furs. He didn't stir. The earth was doing exactly what Elena had promised, protecting them. At 3 a.m., a sound cut through the roar of the wind. It wasn't a tree snapping. That sounded like a gunshot, and she'd heard plenty of those already. This was different. A dull, desperate thumping. Rhythmic. Panic-stricken. Thump, thump, thump. Elena stood up, grabbing the lantern. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No animal knocked like that. She climbed the ladder, the cold air seeping through the cracks of the hatch, stinging her face like needles. She slid the bolt back and pushed. The hatch was heavy with drifted snow, but adrenaline gave her the strength to heave it open. The wind nearly ripped the door from her grip. A wall of whiteout snow blinded her instantly, but through the gale, she saw them. 4 figures huddled in the ruin of the barn. It was the Miller family. Caleb was there, but the arrogant posture from Tuesday was gone. He was hunched over, his expensive parka coated in ice. Beside him was his wife, Jenny, clutching their 2 children. They were shaking so violently it looked painful. "The generator died!" Caleb screamed over the wind, his voice cracking. "The propane lines froze. The house. It's just ice inside. We saw the smoke. He looked up at Elena. His face was gray with early frostbite, his eyes wide and desperate. The man who had mocked her for living in a hole was now standing at the edge of it, begging for his life. Please, Jenny sobbed, her teeth chattering. The kids. Elena looked down at them. She felt the warmth rising from the cellar behind her, a sanctuary she had built with grit and garbage. She could close the hatch. She could let the karma that Caleb talked about so much take its course. It would be justified. Then she felt a small hand on her leg. Leo was on the ladder behind her. He wasn't looking at the storm. He was looking at her. His eyes were wide, waiting to see what kind of person his mother was. The anger in Elena's chest flared hot, then extinguished, replaced by a decisive clarity. "Get in," Elena shouted, stepping aside. "Move, now." It was a clumsy, chaotic descent. Caleb passed the children down to Elena first, then helped his wife. He came last, tumbling onto the dirt floor with a heavy thud, gasping for air. Elena slammed the hatch shut and bolted it, sealing out the screaming wind. The silence that followed was deafening. The cellar was flooded with the smell of wet wool and fear. The Miller children were crying softly. Jenny collapsed near the fire, stripping gloves off her frozen fingers. Caleb stood in the center of the room, water dripping from his beard onto the dry wooden floor Elena had laid. He looked around, taking in the dry walls, the roaring fire, the stack of cured firewood, the smell of rabbit stew simmering in the Dutch oven. It wasn't a hole. It was a home. He looked at Elena, then at the floor, his pride completely shattered. "Here," Elena said, her voice devoid of mockery. She handed him a rough woolen blanket. "Sit by the fire. You're letting the heat out." Caleb took the blanket with trembling hands. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough. Elena didn't smile. She just walked over to the cast-iron pot and picked up the ladle. The storm raged on above them, tearing apart the fences and freezing the pipes of the mansions on the hill. But underground, the fire burned on. Morning didn't break. It slowly filtered down the ventilation shaft, a pale, milky gray. The howling freight train of wind had finally run out of steam, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt loud. Inside the cellar, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and sleeping bodies. Caleb Miller was the first to stir. He sat up on the wooden floor, rubbing a hand over his face. He looked at the rough-hewn timber beams above him, the beams he had laughed at a week ago. They hadn't groaned once during the night. They had held the weight of the snow and the violence of the wind with a steadfast silence. Elena was already awake, tending the fire. She poured hot water from the kettle into a tin mug and held it out to him. "It's pine needle tea," she said quietly. "It's got vitamin C. Drink it." Caleb took the mug. His hands, usually so sure and commanding, were shaking slightly. He looked at his wife and children, still sleeping soundly under Elena's furs, warm and alive because of the woman he had tried to shame. Caleb started, his voice raspy. He cleared his throat, struggling to swallow his massive pride. "The house. The pipes probably burst. We lost everything up there." "You didn't lose everything," Elena said, looking at the sleeping children. "You kept what matters." Leo woke up then, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He saw the Miller kids stirring and immediately reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small wooden bear he had carved from kindling and handed it to Caleb's youngest son. "For you," Leo said. "So you're not scared." Caleb watched the exchange, his face crumbling. The arrogant neighbor was gone, replaced by a man who was deeply, painfully humbled. By noon, the sun was out, blinding and bright. They spent an hour digging the hatch clear. When they finally emerged, the world had changed. The landscape was buried under 3 feet of snow. The Miller's farmhouse on the hill looked dark and cold, a monument to failed technology. But smoke was still curling lazily from the vent in the ground behind them. Caleb turned to Elena. He didn't offer money. He knew better now. He extended a gloved hand. "If you ever need anything," he said, the words heavy with meaning. "Wood, tools, a ride into town. You ask, "You hear me?" "I hear you, Caleb," Elena said, shaking his hand. Her grip was strong. As the Millers trudged back toward their home to begin the repairs, Leo stood beside his mother, watching them go. He slipped his hand into hers. "We saved them, didn't we, Mama?" "We did," Elena nodded. "Are we poor?" Leo asked, looking at their hole in the ground versus the big house on the hill. Elena looked down at the cellar. It was small. It was made of dirt and scavenged trash. But it was warm. It was filled with food they had caught, heat they had engineered, and a peace they had earned. She pulled Leo close, kissing the top of his head. "No, baby," she smiled, feeling a victorious warmth spread through her chest. "We're the richest people in the valley." They climbed back down the ladder, bolting the door against the cold. The fire was waiting. This story wasn't just about surviving a winter storm. It was about the difference between a house and a home. Caleb had a house, expensive, large, and fragile. Elena built a home, humble, strong, and full of warmth. If you were in Elena's shoes, would you have opened that hatch? Or would you have let the karma of the blizzard teach Caleb a lesson? It's a hard choice. Let me know what you would have done in the comments below. If this story warmed your heart, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We have so many more stories of resilience, survival, and the human spirit coming your way. Welcome to the family.